Can you just kind of introduce yourself to the audience?
Sure, yeah. I'm a journalist. I've been a journalist for maybe 15 years now. Well, I started shortly before the Arab Spring in 2011 in Egypt. So, yeah, 2025, that's about 15 years now. Covering mostly the Middle East and environments beyond that, just in the periphery. I live in the US. I live in New York.
Mhm.
I grew up, actually didn't have any background in journalism. I studied finance, actually. That was my educational background. I had a master's in finance, but I just
Uh-huh.
kind of got into this by accident. But I've been doing this for some time now, and yeah, and I have the Substack page, a Substack for analysis and so forth, which I actually welcome people to more questioning or challenging my beliefs because I can sharpen what I believe a bit more or correct myself. So I like to have
Yeah.
discussions with people who have different view than me. I think it's better for
Like,
all of us. It's more interesting actually.
yeah, likewise. I think so too. And you're American. You were born in the U.S. and always been in the U.S.
I'm an American citizen, but I grew up in Toronto actually. I grew up in
Mhm.
Canada. Yeah, yeah. My family's from Pakistan originally, by way of Saudi Arabia, intermediary between that. But
Mhm.
yeah, yeah.
Have you traveled a bit for your journalism, or do you mostly report from the U.S. or what?
I've been to pretty much every country in the Middle East. Um, and yeah, I've been most of the US too, but not for work, just for personal stuff. Sometimes for work too, but mainly Middle East and then Ukraine, Eastern Europe, North Africa, you
Mhm.
know, trying to think where else. Yeah, that's mostly the crux of where I've gone for work.
Yeah, and you used to work for The Intercept, right?
I did, yeah. Now we have a spin-off of that called Drop Site News, or separate site with many of the same personnel who helped found the Intercept.
Gotcha. So yeah, I've always liked your work. I like your Substack. There's a couple articles that are interesting recently that I wanted to talk about. I you know the Yeah, well, I want to talk about the last one because I think it's provocative. I don't agree with it, but it is very provocative. It's called "The Iran War and What Comes Next." And my reading of it is, I don't think you say it exactly explicitly, but this is what it sounds like. That basically Israel, and I don't think you like, I'm not unclear as to exactly why this is, but you think Israel basically is a state that's geared towards forever war. So if Iran falls or something happens to Iran, you think basically Israel is going to be at war with somebody else before soon. Is that right? Before long? Is that right?
Well, I should explain my premises,
Sure.
how I view the world generally first. I think that, it's if you look at history, war is sort of the default in some way, actually. It's sort of, I have what you call a tragic view of human nature, where I expect, we're not done with wars. There's no sense, I don't really subscribe to the Steven Pinker analysis that the world is becoming more docile or peaceful. I respect his view, and I think it's a very optimistic and interesting view, but I don't really find it to be compelling based on my observations and based on my understanding of history. So I don't think that the fact that Israel would be at war indefinitely in the future is necessarily aberrant. I think that it's kind of how countries which are hegemonic or have overcome their rivals or even in a position of rising, they will engage in war. And that if there was not many more wars in the future, I would be very surprised. And I think that
Mhm.
this whole idea is sort of new in human history. It's sort of a byproduct of the 20th century when there are two utopian ideologies which I can think of right now, which thought of wars being somehow banished, or interstate war, you could say, as being something a relic of the past. One was obviously communism, and the second was liberalism. And when I had very impeccably liberal views, I would say, well, of course, we're just kind of ironing out the kinks now. We're moving on to a perfect system where war is not going to happen anymore. I don't really think that I think that all events are pointing in the opposite direction. And secondly, I do watch Israeli television and read the statements of their politicians, and more importantly, listen to statements of senior security officials. And everything see is seeing that we're gathering steam for many more generations of war ahead. I believe that Benny Gantz at a graduation ceremony last year for Israeli military officials said something to the effect too that many, many wars are coming, and I didn't find it surprising. I think that everyone is expecting such a thing, and it's not. It doesn't make Israel particularly unique in that view. I just think that uh, the liberal era, the peak of it, has sort of passed globally, and also within Israel, where in the '90s there was the pinnacle of what you can call the labor Zionist experiment, and it almost manifested in the peace deal with the Palestinians. Unfortunately, some events intervened. The assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, Second Intifada, and that they fumbled the bag, you could say, where we could have ended that conflict, but it didn't happen. So I think we are, you know, to expect a future of war, as is the norm in human history, and as human nature sort of suggests would be the case. Now, there are many people who said that the level of destructive weaponry such that exists today and economic intercontinent connectivity as well too should both disincentivize us from war. But I think that again, that's something which is being disproven by events, even outside the Middle East. So I do believe that it's a forever war, but I think that life is kind of a forever war. That said, I do have ideas for how to attenuate the conflict between
Yeah,
Israel and
but
its
you do think, let
neighbors.
me interrupt. So you do you, but it's not just you think everyone is going to be at war forever. You wouldn't say the same about you. Like you don't expect 50 years from now, like 50 years, Japan or Sweden to be fighting. Maybe they will fight a war, but you expect Israel to be for this period of history to be fighting a lot more wars than most other countries, most other developed countries, especially, right?
Well, there's another aspect that I think should emphasize, which informs my worldview, is that when I was many years ago, I read Samuel Huntington, and at the time, I thought this was ridiculous. I thought this was like almost offensive, and I had read not just Clash of Civilizations and his books on American domestic politics and
Yeah.
identity. And at that time, I'll say that the reason which what has changed my worldview is actually my job, actually, just to
Mhm.
observe conflict and observe, especially ethnic conflict and religious conflict, or you can say civilizational identity-based conflict, is very insoluble. So I thought it was very easy to laugh at Samuel Huntington in the 90s and 2000s. After 2010s, I was like, this is very difficult to laugh at this guy. Something is changing, and I need to update my prior beliefs. So I think that according to Mr. Huntington, what he said was that there are certain he kind of identified the fault lines of what he saw as conflict. So Japan and Sweden would not fight a war because of the fact that there's no real tension or civilizational fault line that they could interact over. Whereas he called it kind of very closely in a lot of other places, including Ukraine and Russia at the time when I think many people thought that was a ridiculous sort of prediction to make. But I think he's proven right. So I think with the Israel conflict with his neighbors is that at present, at least, there is not enough zone of overlap in the conception of one another to attenuate the likelihood of conflict. And it seems like the trends are all going the opposite direction. There's more hatred and there's more suspicion and there's more fear mutually, such that I would expect this to be, I'll be shocked if something happened otherwise. I would think it's almost a very utopian, positive optimistic thing to expect otherwise, which we'll get later in the conversation. I do have some ideas nonetheless. But that's why I feel that this is a likely fault line because it's just an identity based fault line which no one has come up with a plausible solution for yet.
Yeah. I mean, that's yeah, I mean, okay, so that's good. It's good to kinda go into the, kind of the underlying assumptions of your model of the world. Okay, so yeah, my model would be a little bit different. I do believe that there has been obviously there's still wars, but I do believe in general we move towards more peace. I think data backs that up. I think it's easy to, especially if you're a journalist, you're going to see a lot of conflicts because that's where you go and that's where you cover and that's what you pay attention to, right? But there's a lot of regions of the world which are not violent, and you sort of need the statistical perspective to kind of see where we are at the point in history and whether we can say that anything's changed over the last, I don't know, 50, 75 years or whatever. And so, with the Israeli case in particular, I had people I would talk to, like Philippe Lemon, who are more dovish, thought Israel should not respond so forcefully to October 7th. And they would say, look, if they really go to war with Gaza, if they, try to do something like really, really bad to Gaza, you might bring in Egypt, might fight against Israel. You might bring Turkey into it, and there's no hint of like, at least on the immediate horizon, like tomorrow, right? If Egypt or Turkey went to war with Israel, that would be quite surprising. Same with Jordan and these other Middle Eastern states. Um, and so there's another way to look at it, which is basically like the world is kind of over war. There's still the Palestinian question because that's never been solved. Kind of, they don't have a nation. They're just kind of outsiders. They're in Gaza and the West Bank, and Israel is moving more into the West Bank, and so that issue is still there. But then basically what you have is just a few ideological actors who, other countries might not like Israel. Erdogan might denounce Israel, and people might protest against them every once in a while. But the only people who really have appetite to fight them are Hezbollah, right? And Israel. If Hezbollah didn't
Mm.
attack Israel, Israel didn't want anything from Lebanon, right? So that was completely by choice. And then Iran, which doesn't have a territorial dispute or anything like that with Israel. It's basically just Iran, and it's Iran's proxies, Hezbollah, and then it's the Palestinian issue. So my view is basically most of these countries are just over it. And basically, there's still the Palestinian issue. And then there's a finite number of enemies, right? It's Hezbollah. We'll see if they come back. There's Iran. And, this could potentially be solved with just knocking over Iran, maybe, maybe not. Or if it continues, it's going to be basically Iran and whatever's able to rebuild and the Palestinians against Israel. So what's wrong with that view?
I think that so in my article, which I encourage people to read, I'm taking a very long term, like a broad, trend based and strategic view of the situation. In the short term, I think everything you said is plausible, actually, and I think that, and I said this too. I find that Iran's posture towards Israel is very, actually, I should say a broader point. Iran is a number one problem that Iran has the gerontocracy,
Hmm.
and the leadership of Iran has this. Third worldist Islamist ideology, which is really a dated
Hmm.
ideology. It's the Ayatollah Khamenei is like 86 years old. He remembers the time of Che Guevara and the Viet Cong and all these things vividly, like they happened yesterday. So he has a worldview which is inapt to the contemporary way in which both political and military conflicts are uh, engaged upon or prepared for, and so forth. And Iran does not have a really democratic decision-making bodies inside the society, such that the talents of Iranians are very smart. Like the talents of the people can be somehow reflected in the way the country is governed. So I think that yeah, it's probably good if that actually happens. If what you're saying, if Iran should pivot away from the Middle East in general, I think
Hmm.
that Levant, outside of Iraq, Iran is not very popular in the Middle East, and not just with Israelis, with Arabs as well too. It's
Yeah.
despite its putative championing of the Palestinian cause, very, very viewed very unfavorably. I can speak Persian. I talk to people in Iran pretty much every single day. I will say that, this event, what's happening right now, despite their dislike of the government, which is quite widespread, I would say probably majority sentiment, it's certainly embittered people's experiences. They're actually getting really angry about what's happening right now in the country. So I think that in the ideal circumstance, first of all, Iran should try to off ramp from this conflict, at least sign a cold peace with the Israelis, such to leave each other alone for the time being, if it's possible now, which for some reason I don't think it may be. And then you can pivot away from this part of the world, pivot towards the natural sphere of influence in the Caucasus and Central Asia and even South Asia and so forth. But I think that, it doesn't, it's actually this whole model that Iran chose to pick a war with Israel. It served two purposes. They wanted to expand their own influence in the Arab world militarily. The reason for this is that the traumatic foundational experience of the current ruling elite in Iran was actually the Iran-Iraq war, when they felt the whole Arab world had ganged up on them. So they want to have quote unquote strategic depth in the whole Arab world. They want to control as much as they can, such that nobody could re-engineer that again. But they're also ideologically hostile to Israel, so they have to fight Israel as part of this as well too. It didn't really work, and it was a non-state centric. It was actually based on undermining the states around them. So if you want to engage in a conflict, or you want to even be rich or have a society or whatever else it is, you need states in 2025. You can't do that with sub-state militias undermining countries and so forth. So I think this whole paradigm should be is something which is dying. Actually, this whole whatever's happening today is the last gasp of an old paradigm, and good riddance. Actually, good riddance to it. It's very irrational and, as I said, a product of a gerontocracy. That said, the problem is that, and although, as I mentioned, we'll discuss this later in the conversation, but at present, there's not a alternate model for ameliorating this conflict that Israel has with its neighbors, even if it's a cold conflict. And I do talk to people in the militaries and governments in other countries around the region, And I will say that the younger generation, just as they're in Iran, they don't like really like Khamenei's or don't, I think, in my opinion, appropriately agree with his approach to politics. They also don't like Sisi's approach or King Abdullah's or
Mm,
Erdogan's. They
mm,
view them as sort of byproducts of era which is rapidly shifted, and they don't remember Camp David. They don't like it. They think it was a foolish decision, or they don't understand the context in which it came about. So, just like the Israeli counterparts, they're also thinking about the next stage of conflict and how it'll manifest and so forth. And again, I'm talking in like generations. I'm not talking about the next 5 years or 20 years
yeah.
even. I just think that it's inevitable unless you find a new political or identity structure with which to forestall this. And when I look at these strategic trends, you look at the output of these countries, the militaries and so forth, including Israel, they do think in long term, they can foresee a conflict 45 years away. That's the idea behind the whole thing. So, absent some effort to create a new political structure, I do think it's inevitable that more conflicts will happen with Turkey, with Azerbaijan, with Egypt. Well, Azerbaijan is actually a complicated subject, but the Egypt, even further afield as well too. And the Israelis, after the fall of Syria, you could say, they did publish a Nagel Commission. That's a commission commissioned by the Israeli MOD. They did publish a whole study about why Turkey would be the next conflict they fight, because
Mm,
the revival of Ottoman power, as they see a neo-Ottoman power in the Middle East, obviously will lead to a tension and a conflict between two countries, just the way that China and the US see each other as inevitably destined for conflict for structural reasons. So I think that it's also perceived in the Israeli side. I think that, maybe people who work in defense and things like that are overly pessimistic, but
mm.
I think it's there's a reason that they're in these important jobs.
Yeah, and you brought up Syria. I think it's interesting because if I was thinking about your article, and I was thinking if there's one. So the way I read it, I mean, you're taking a more kind of, kind of broader long-term perspective and kind of based more on priors and ideas about human nature and where we are in history. Yeah, I was thinking more in terms of Israeli specific kind of arguments. And if I was going to make one that I think is actually, a strong, like strong piece of evidence in favor of this, I think it's Israel's. If you think that Israel is kind of this country that always needs war and is hyper paranoid, and wants to, is always going to find enemies. If you think that, I think that the what's happened to Syria after the Assad regime fell, I think would support that idea because. Jolani Al Shara, right? He goes by his real name now. He is basically saying all the things that you would want to say. I would think if you were Israel, you would be reassured by a lot of things he's saying. Clearly, does not want to pick a fight with the Israelis. Um, maybe you could explain a little bit what's going on in Syria because I have a friend who's very pro-Israel, and he says basically he buys the line that there's some kind of persecution of the Druze, and the Israelis are stepping in to protect the Druze. I haven't looked that much into it, but I feel skeptical towards that. Doesn't seem like that's what's going on here. But that Israel, despite what the Syrian government is saying now, is basically just taking land and wiping out like all potential military capabilities. So it sounds like even if a regime comes to power that is potentially trying to play nice with it, Israel is still going to be paranoid about Syria. Just your impressions of what's going on in Syria and whether that kind of perspective on what Israel's doing makes sense.
So I covered the Syrian civil war for many years, and I remember interviewing people in refugee camps around the region, Syrians around 2016, 15. And we talk about a bunch of things. We talk about Israel, and there was such a cognitive shift happening that moment because the trauma of the war and all the things that are being revealed. And they were like, yeah, if Israel helped us today, and we would like support Israel at this point. Like we're so angry at Hezbollah or Iran and so forth. They would say in a heartbeat. That was a very common sentiment that I heard
Mm,
firsthand. So, they didn't do anything like that. And so whatever. And then, but still, like when the government fell, people were very elated and they were like, we just don't want any conflicts with anybody now. We want to just live our lives. We haven't had a life for 15 years. We would like to go back to just rebuilding this mess of a country. I was there in January just after the government fell. And, they don't have, it's like Syria is living in like 1850. Like I've never seen that level of devastation anywhere I've been. There's no power. People are living with no water and stuff. Despite that, with immense dignity and graciousness somehow, but they don't have the capacity to fight anybody right now. So they didn't want to fight Israel, but they're very shocked, I think. And when talking to people and writing about it, that Israel started bombing Syria not just the first couple of days, but pretty much since then they've been doing that. And in southern Syria, they've actually annexed a lot of territory, and this week they're demolishing people's houses because they want to build military bases there and things like that. So, it's kind of sent a message that even if you want to stay out of it, you kind of, this is not really an option. They're gonna come for you one way or another. That said, wisely, they're still trying to attenuate and stay out of the conflict and try to. They have no capacity to fight such a much more advanced. If Syria's in 1850, Israel's like in like 2035. It's like a very, really, really big difference here. So, I do think this is an example. And, I'm not saying this is even unique about Israel per se. A lot of countries may have acted like this historically. The thing is that Israel at present, and you can see this with the Gaza situation too, is it's not using violence as a tool to achieve a political end. So as I can see, they're not giving saying if you work with us and you play nice, here's another alternate thing we can both agree on. It's tolerable for both of us. They're just saying we're using violence as an end to itself, and you can leave or you could die or whatever else it is, but we're not giving you. There's no plan like B for our vision that we have right now. And again, a new Israeli government can come into power, which has totally different views and so forth. I don't really see that on the horizon per se. They seem to have very similar views about different things, or maybe they express them a bit differently. But yes, if the violence is just being used for its own sake, then one can only draw certain conclusions from this. That there's not really, alternate kind of like thing to work on here. I think Syria is just trying to survive now, and they're seeing if the Turks can help them, and maybe get the Israelis to back off. Maybe Washington can help the Israelis to back off a little bit. I don't know. Maybe they can back off a little bit. I don't think they're gonna. I don't know how much they can get out of them at this point. But yes, it seems like a very good example. That's a proximate example right next to the borders. That you're not really. There's not really an alternative here. It's not gonna leave you alone even if you want to. Unfortunately.
Yeah. And what about this Drew's justification? How much legitimacy is there to this thing?
It's a very legitimate justification because, first of all, most of the Jews are actually trying to side with the government. There's certain factions. There's very divided divisions in Syrian society, and there's certain factions who are more tied to the old government. There were these NDF militias, and there's been conflicts inside Syrian society over the legacy of the previous government. At that time, obviously, this is ripe territory for a foreign government to come intervene. And they did so, and they actually have mixed their messaging. Sometimes they say we have no stake about this. Sometimes they say we're really invested in the Druze. Right now, they're not really saying that. It's very opportunistically employed this justification, and it's kind of like Russians like being weird intervening in the Donbass